Tuatahi, he taere tonu ngā mihi kia tātou katoa I roto tēnei whare o Taiwatan. Ngā mihi kia koe Kwam Kuiam mo o kupu hei whakawate te huarahi kei muri a tātou. Huri no I tēnei whare ngā mihi kia tātou katoa ko tai mai nei ki te tautoko tēnei kaupapa. So I want to again support the acknowledgements of the Musqueam Nation and their presence here in nurturing these lands on which we're meeting. I want to also acknowledge all of the First Nations peoples from across Great Turtle Island and to further acknowledge all of you who have gathered here today for this important meeting. And in that sense acknowledge the extended family of UBC and all that you bring with you and I guess as a segue into positioning myself to say that that the expectation is that all of us have experience, all of us have knowledge that can help the ultimate resolution of what we're trying to do here in this discussion. So in my language I acknowledge all of you. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. So I won't talk about my background too much other than to say what I bring forward today is based on things that I've learnt, things as an educator of nearly, I would think 60 years if you count the fact that I started kindergarten when I was 4. I've been in education all my life, in institutions, teaching or learning. So I bring that to you, but I also want to say I bring the blisters on my hands. And the reason I say that is because it's all very well knowing about these things and talking about them, but unless you've actually done them, and unless we move to enact what we're talking about, then we're still a long way back and we still have much to do. So I want to share, if you like, the fact that a lot of the things I'm talking about are things that I've been engaged in myself. I'm sharing because I know they work. I want to acknowledge the different cultural contexts, that there's not an immediate translation from the context that I bring from my Māori background in New Zealand to the cultural context that resides here. And I simply am sharing different ideas that I've seen, the models that we've tried to develop, and where we are up to in our particular struggle. And hopefully that you will draw down those things that are relevant here and that are useful to you in the things that you want to do, particularly in relation to mentoring students. Another reason that I think the things that I've got to say travel quite well is that we share the Captain Cook experience, notwithstanding that we're in Vancouver, but you know, there's around the Pacific Rim, most of us share the, if you like, our colonising experience has some strong similarities, and therefore that allows us to sort of share ideas in that way. And the last point I would make is that in most Indigenous jurisdictions there is still a major struggle in terms of huge disparities in the social and economic underdevelopment of communities. And I will argue as I go through this that one of the major imperatives, I think, for the Academy to transform itself, one of the major factors that centralise the issue of how we educate in our communities is related to that fact, that there will not be a significant revolution in terms of the socio-economic disparities in many of our communities without a prior or simultaneous education revolution. It's that important. All right. So what I want to talk about today is actually not so much the mentoring of students. I think that's a really important element, and I will eventually get there. But I guess to capture what I'm focused on, I'm really talking about mentoring the institution. Because many of the things that we're trying to assume agency over in terms of developing change at the student level have a foundation of in terms of the impediment that's located in the structures of the institution. So in order, we need to have a good critical analysis of what is going wrong in order for us to be able to respond and get things right. So I want to spend a little bit of time reflecting on that and what we've learned in our New Zealand context of the impediments in the institutional environment. So just to backtrack a little bit, I come from a tribal university, a long trek through the system, and have ended up back in my own community. Just quickly, we're an institution that is a graduate institution. We have over 100 doctoral students currently on our books. And we are an institution that's largely had to pay for itself. We sued the government along the way because of various anomalies, and the settlement has helped us position ourselves. We're an international institution. We deal in different jurisdictions across the world with Indigenous populations. And as I say, we have a major focus on developing our graduate student profile. Our hope is that we want for our students to have cultural excellence and confidence in who they are, as well as academic excellence and world knowledge. It is not either or. And I haven't come across any Indigenous sort of environment where people are just struggling for one thing. We're very much a cultural institution. Our language is very much part of it, and the cultural element is embedded in most things we do. Here's some of our 2017 doctoral graduates. And so just a quick overview. We're about the same size as BC, New Zealand, 4 million people. Māori are approximately 15% of the overall population. We've got a single treaty which gives a little bit of leverage in terms of our engagement with government. And we have about 45 recognised tribes. The conditions, socio-economic conditions are widening, if you like. The gaps are widening rather than closing. So we've still got a lot of work to do in our context about responding to that. I've already made this point, but perhaps I should say this, is that colonisation hasn't gone away. That often it's just changed shape. And what the trick is now is to develop the appropriate literacy to recognise how those impediments are still impacting on our communities. So we need to focus on Indigenous graduate development more generally, and we've heard from various sources why that should be, including the UNDRIP declaration in 2007, but the fact that there's 370 million Indigenous communities, people, that suffer from these high and disproportionate levels of social and economic underdevelopment. At UBC, like many of our New Zealand university institutions, there is a need to develop multiple sites of intervention. So this is understanding where the blockages and where the impediments might be, and to create, if you like, the appropriate sort of space to allow us to get on with our primary task, which is to develop success in full learners. But current production rates are currently poor for most of the public institutions across BC. So there's more to be done. The notion of the public institution and its responsibility is an important way of thinking about this. What is a public institution and what is its responsibility? And you know, the identification in the report from the Truth and Reconciliation Council around residential schools identified a lot of issues related to ongoing assimilation in different aspects of education. And for when I was at University of Auckland, we were very much part of the Universitas 21, and very much part of the, had a relationship with UBC and various other institutions. And you know, there was a great store put on the idea of being a world-class institution. And you know, my critique, if you like, is that it's hard to claim to be world-class if you have a significant part of the population that's underserved. Okay, so the last thing I want to say about the context in which we're negotiating here is that not all disciplines are positioned the same, and that not all Indigenous students, they're not a homogenous group in the sense of what they aspire to be and what they want from the institution and so on. So we're sort of trying to work, if you like, within some generalizations of trying to provide many of the things that aren't there for students at the moment. But there are some students who feel quite comfortable in what's available and so on, and that's great. All right, so all of the reconciliation stuff is front and centre. In New Zealand, it's very similar. We've had you know, a history of again marginalisation in our schools, and a very deliberate strategy, which in the end has been assimilating. And so the struggle today is to try and rebuild, if you like, our cultural platform and our cultural elements related to language, knowledge, and so on. Right, so I want to say this, that when we're thinking about transforming Indigenous graduate student experience or graduate studies, there are multiple sites of engagement that we need to understand and get into. So we need to think of the institution as we need to engage in what I call a 360 way, that in the past many of our initiatives have been single policy initiatives, that we will do this and somehow we're going to cure the First Nations or Māori educational underdevelopment. And that has not worked. So what we're saying now, in our context of New Zealand, is that we need to be engaged in several sites simultaneously to try and make the difference. Often, we assume the human development perspective on transforming. That is, transformation begins, you mature it through the system. And in many instances, I think it is used as a convenient excuse to do nothing. In our New Zealand context, we keep blaming the primary schools for the lack of students in the academy. The primary schools blame the the kindergartens and the preschool element for not doing their job and so on. And it's got that mentality, if you like, of this human development thesis that change matures through the system. So more often than not, we get a heavy investment in early childhood education, which is fine at one level, but when it's the only thing that's being done, year 1, year 2, year 3, might be year 4, year 5, year 6, and then change of government, bang, back to square one. And we don't really get significant purchase in our change factors. Anyway, so if you get the idea here of this image of the water coming through many holes in terms of you know, the institution, and that we need to be responsive as best we can to many of those holes, otherwise we go under. We need to understand that deficit theory hasn't gone away, that it's still you know, embedded in different people's minds. When I went to school, that was the major explanation of educational underdevelopment, that there's something wrong with Māori kids, there's something wrong with their culture, their parents, and that all winds up in their educational underachievement. We need to, I think, problematise the new efforts around what we call self-esteem theory. So self-esteem theory is about, well, let's give a little bit of a cultural decoration to the room. Let's say, kia ora everyone, good morning. So we're doing these sort of little bits of cultural input. And, you know, so in the end, it becomes a sugar-coated candy to help the same old stuff go down. It still doesn't address some of the major issues about diversity at the end. So what, you know, the learning that's more likely to occur is, again, the same prescription that hasn't worked. So we, you know, I'm not totally against self-esteem theory, because for some people that's all they can do, and it's, you know, might be okay in the short term, but it's not the answer. It's not going to lead to major change in terms of overturning our needs in our communities. So our best responses have been in the cultural alternatives and the diversity approach inside institutions, and these are not new ideas. You know, we've drawn on a lot of you know, educational theoretical insights. You know, the Bourdieu thesis of social and cultural reproduction, understanding how that works and what the disconnect is, where kids who come from a particular background and cultural circumstance get to the academy and it's a totally different cultural and social environment. So, you know, the disconnection is felt in many ways, whether it's in the pedagogical elements of the teaching practice, whether it's in the very selected nature of the knowledge content that's being expressed, and so on. So, you know, that's what we're, as, you know, those of us working, you know, we choose to work in this institutional environment. That's all I'm pointing out here, is that's what we've got to somehow cope with, understand, and work ways, if you like, to bridge students through this particular element. I'm not saying that it's our job necessarily to overthrow the institution and to change it completely. I think what I'm doing here is identifying what this shape of the impediment is, so that we've got a good sense of, when we're dealing with the students, our responses are going to be more accurate. So when we, you know, we need sort of big picture sort of ways of thinking about what we're doing. So, so you've got graduate studies, which is a horizontal element that stretches across many departments, if you like, and institutes and so on. And that's one element that we need to respond to, is how we, and that's the very important question that's brought us all here today, is really how to make graduate studies more effective. And that's fine, but on its own it's not going to do the job. And so what I want to pose here is the notion of horizontal and vertical engagement in the institutional environment. So in the vertical engagement, it means that departments programs, and others have to take up the challenge as well, and to develop initiatives that there is, if you like, a tension between these two elements, the vertical and the horizontal, but when they work together well, it can make a significant difference. So it's the other side of this is, you know, it's important not to export this issue outside of the department level to graduate studies to do. Graduate studies can do this, a certain amount of stuff in coordination and provide elements, but the bulk of the work really has to happen at the chalk face, as it were. And then all of that is, you know, so you could actually take this as the university plan as the horizontal, and the faculty's responsiveness as the vertical element. So you can sort of play with that idea. But in the end, all of us apparently are being called to attention by the President's plan. So I've already said that point. It's important because that's impact, if you like. Just go back to this point. This is impact. The impact of what we do has actually got to make a difference in our communities of interest. That's my view. And so our students, if you like, become transforming agents, are able to work in their communities and to make a difference. So there's a tension here for many students and for different parts of the institution between the notion of what I call a privatised academic and an academic who's committed to being transforming. So you can think on that idea. Again, lots of different sites where we need to engage with, and I won't dwell on that. Let me talk about the notion. I'll just take one notion here, but there's a whole lot of contesting items around the neoliberal, market-driven sort of university structure and the cultural and social expectations of Indigenous communities, because often they come into conflict. I'll just talk about a couple of these perhaps. So individualism, the idea of the possessive individual, is in our context in New Zealand contradictory to the cultural expectation of working collectively, collaboratively and as extended family, and having responsibilities to others. This goes to the notion, you know, of what counts as the social, what counts as society. You know, so there's a whole lot of elements that are potentially contesting there. Equity is, you know, and this is some of the stuff that's going off in the States at the moment. But, you know, the level playing field idea of equity, that argues that we must treat every citizen exactly the same. If we give more to one set of citizens, then we're being unfair to the others. And, you know, that's often a captured interpretation. I won't say hegemony at this point, but a captured interpretation of what equity is, because for many of those, if you apply the level playing field idea, you'll see the diagram on my immediate left here, is that you give exactly the same to every citizen, and if you start off with less, you're going to, the discrepancy is still going to be the same. All right, so what equity has been argued in the New Zealand context is what we call compensatory forms of equity, where those who need more are given more to help them come up and to be part of an equal outcome, if you like. So unequal treatment for equal outcome. This, of course, is being challenged at the moment in the States with, again, So different guises in which this appears in our institution is in curriculum content, in the way in which we incorporate testing to reproduce the dominant sort of expectations, and it's in our pedagogies. It's in the commodification of knowledge. So I might also point out that the Mātātua Declaration was, which is now a United Nations appendix, was developed at our tribal institution about 15 years ago. And it's a declaration on intellectual and cultural property rights. Indigenous theorizing, a lot of misinterpretation around what Indigenous theorizing is. And it's not replacing Western theory or theory in general. In fact, to hold a notion of Indigenous theorizing, you really need to know the other theoretical domain in which you're arguing your space. But for many students in our New Zealand context, some of the theories that they're using don't quite fit all the time, and often they're augmenting their studies or their research with what we call Indigenous theoretical tools or Indigenous methodologies to enable them to do what they want to do in the academy. The point I'm making and need to emphasise is that Indigenous theorising is not an either-or, and it is necessary. So let me now, those are sort of some of the issues, if you like. Let me get to some of the transforming ideas that might connect with how you're thinking and what might help you to carry on and respond to different students. I'll spend a little bit of time here on, again, the University of Auckland. Why? Because it's very similar in terms of its intention. It wants to be a research-led institution. It is, a very comprehensive sort of environment. So part of this is useful for you to, I think, see what's happening there. The Vice-Chancellor, John Hood, who we got rid of and sent to Oxford University. We annoyed Jim. But he was a very actually excellent Vice-Chancellor who saw very clearly the need for structural change and did it, and just required it, and it happened. And I have to say that in the revolution that he caused, that no one died. The place didn't fall apart. In fact, everyone was a lot happier. That was my view of it. That you can do some of these things, and it can add value, if you like, to the institutional environment. So we had a sort of like an institution within the institution. We had a beautiful carved house, cultural space, but always the question is, you can be as flash as you like, but it's actually what you do that's important. We went after and appointed outstanding Māori staff from everywhere. And so we had not just appointing outstanding Māori staff, but in every level, deans, pro-vice-chancellors, on council, they were everywhere in the institution, and lecturers and so on. Our students there, we engaged with, top theoretical minds, and I often like teasing people who, that our Māori students engaged with Jacques Derrida after he came back from South Africa, and they got on really well. In fact, they admired him very much in the way in which he engaged with students. And the point I'm trying to make here is that its theory is important, irrespective. It's not just one, we're not just arguing about our own Indigenous element. So 360 approach, I'll finish after this. Is that right? How's my timing? I'll do this as the last slide. So I want to just say that there are important elements here that are, I think, that all of us need to consider as we look to do better for our students. One is positionality, understand our capacities and limitations. And it's really great that people are here today, because people are obviously saying, I want to know about how we might do things a little bit differently, how we might be able to support the success of Indigenous students. There's a factor related to criticality, which I've just gone through really, which is we need the critical tools to be able to see the impediments, to create, if you like, a critical understanding of the environment in which we're trying to help our students to negotiate and to be successful. There's a need to look beyond the culturalist arguments that we can, it's all about changing people, but to also understand that there's a lot of structural elements, impediments that get in the way. And again, I'm not saying that we necessarily need to tear down the institution, but I think we need to know how those things can impede the success of our students and to engage with them. Practicality, and the idea here is that we're constantly reviewing what we're doing, because we want to do it better. That's because we know that we're in an environment that in some places is not working very well. And then the idea of transforming is important from the point of view that in the title of this Transforming Indigenous Graduate Work is an ambiguous title. And I mean both meanings. That we need to transform the way in which we deal with graduate students, the processes, if you like, but we also need to produce students who are transforming in terms of their abilities and outcomes. We won't go through the logic stuff. I'll flick to the end. I should, no, I won't talk about of how we position incremental change in the things that we do. I was going to show you a model of a research project that was done as a PhD thesis, which impacted a whole tribe, and how that worked. So, and many different outcomes for the tribe. But I'll flick through that. We won't. And so this will be the segue into the panel. So there are some quite specific things that we can do for that engage with the idea of mentoring students and to help students negotiate their way through through their studies here. In New Zealand, we developed a National Research Centre of Excellence, which then we put inside this research centre a mentoring program for our PhD growth. And the mentoring program aimed to build 500 Māori PhDs in 5 years. That was in a context where we were running at about 1 Māori PhD per year. And cut a long story short, it took us about 7 years to do that. and now it's got its own momentum in the New Zealand context, where the tribal university is quite a significant player in the production of doctoral students. So, not to say that all of the knowledge, good knowledge, is done in the academy, all right? So we also support the fact that knowledge belongs in our communities, and there is good knowledge there as well. We've deliberately targeted PhD growth because the transforming element, impetus required for our change in our communities had to be, to get beyond that human development thesis of growing from the bottom, was to go in at the top and grow doctoral students, grow them down, go in from the side and help different programs around research and other areas. So in other words, multiple interventions and not just this top-down. So this is a picture of one of our My programs, and so the woman with the grey bit in here is graduated in the medical research, and her study was on her PhD was on the clubfoot and the propensity, the DNA related to that. There's a guy sitting against the window there who's now on faculty at UVic. And all the rest have their PhDs. We have writing retreats as part of that. And when we were here, the SAGE program, which you're going to hear from the team shortly, we had it going all over BC. Again, stimulating, graduate, and many of those people that you see in these photographs have all got PhDs or ed docs. So I'll leave it there, and I guess my summary point is that we need to struggle on two fronts. We need to understand and develop this critical understanding of the context in which we're trying to negotiate inside the institution, if we are to be useful in terms of a mentoring support for our students that come under our care. So thank you very much. Kia ora.